Alrighty, so we seem to be live. I'm gonna check. I'm going to check that if we're live or not. Um, by by whether I get audio through the channel or not. So I'm just checking. In the meantime, I'm just going to set up. What's going on here? How come I can't hear anything? I can't hear it. Alrighty, so we seem to be right. We're in it. So let me just set up a little bit here. Okay, hi everybody. How many people we got watching right now? 3. Woo! That's like 3 times more than usual. Okay, today, actually, hey Trude, my name is Sydney Winston. That's all that's really all I can tell you, because I'm not a doctor, a lawyer, or anything like that. But what I am is a student of a lifelong student of history, really. Today's relevance is regarding the book of Revelation. I want to talk about that. Actually, I don't want to talk about that. I want to present a talk. Okay, and hello Scott, and hello Trude, and everybody else. Good to see you guys. Now, while I prepare, I just want to introduce you. I just want to give Aaron Ra another chance to present a 10 or 11 minute talk while I get ready for the rest of it. In order to do that, there we go. Let me get myself out of there, and let Aaron take it away for 10 minutes while I set up.
Hi, I'm Aaron from Living Science Videos. In previous videos, we talked about what some people used to think about what life is and where it comes from. We listed the criteria required to be considered alive, but we didn't really talk about how the first life began or the science behind the origin of life.
It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are now present which could ever have been present. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond, with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed.
Everyone understands that there was once a time when nothing yet lived on this planet, so how did it come about? The short answer is we still don't know exactly how that happened, but that doesn't mean we don't know anything. It's still a puzzle, but we have some of the pieces, enough to know some of the answer. Science can only consider what the evidence indicates, and this is where biology refers to geology. In fact, multiple fields of science overlap to reveal the same pattern. There's a detailed record written in the rocks, literally recorded in stone in the many layers of the geologic column. This history of life on Earth has been well established for centuries and is made more robust with every new discovery. We're not just talking about fossils, but trace indications of changing environmental conditions in different periods down through the ages. According to every ounce of paleontological evidence anyone has ever dug up, the further back in time you look, the simpler and more similar living things appear to be until there are only single cells, and prior to that there's no evident life of any kind at all. There were no primates 100 million years ago, no mammals 200 million years ago, no dinosaurs 300 million years ago, and no land animals whatsoever 400 million years ago. 500 million years ago, there weren't any insects or vertebrates with actual bones, and 600 million years ago, there weren't even the most primitive fish yet. All there are from back that far are things so bizarre we don't know what they are. We've never found any trace of fossils for macroscopic life forms prior to 700 million years ago, but we do have bacterial microfossils covering another 2.8 billion years prior to the first multicellular anythings we've ever found a trace of. The only possible conclusion we can draw from all that is that for the first 80% of the history of life on this planet, the most advanced organisms were merely microbes. It is very rare that anything is ever fossilized, and when that happens, it's usually only the hard parts that leave any impression. We can still find tracks and tunnels of worms and that sort of thing, but not everything leaves trace fossils. The smaller it is, the harder it is to leave a recognizable imprint. So if we're talking about single-celled microbes without any bones or shells or teeth, then circumstances have to be perfect, and we'd have to know exactly where to look, or we wouldn't find any trace of them at all. Stromatolites are a notable exception. Some microbes, like cyanobacteria, live in colonies and leave secretions that catch grains of dust and concrete them, eventually building up these large rock-like structures. These account for some of the oldest fossils in the world, dating back 3.5 billion years. Some stromatolite-building microbes use photosynthesis to produce their food, and they can live without oxygen, but they expel oxygen as a waste product, just like plants do today. The abundance of these type fossils all over the world for billions of years before the appearance of multicellular organisms implied that they produced a lot of oxygen, enough to envelop the whole world. Initially, this oxygen was absorbed into the oceans and then into exposed iron on land, turning it into iron ore. But rock layers from 600 million years ago showed that they had finally absorbed all the oxygen they could, and the rest became our atmosphere and our ozone layer relatively quickly. Prior to that, it seems that the atmosphere was made of greenhouse gases that would have been poisonous to us and wouldn't have protected us against solar radiation. However, oxygen is poisonous to most anaerobic organisms, and the new atmosphere would have killed off many primordial life forms. So the world in which life first emerged would have seemed to us like an inhospitable, toxic, volcanic nightmare. It was more chemically active and radioactive, with the moon much, much closer than it is today. It was a much more energetic world, and that may have been the key to cooking up increasingly complex chemicals, eventually leading to life. Some people thought that a single experiment could produce life from simple chemicals, but they didn't realize how complex living cells actually are. This would require multiple processes over a series of different stages. Some of that happens easily. The ingredients which form the most basic cell structures create a phospholipid bilayer automatically upon contact with water due to their combined polarity. Likewise, the function of enzymes and transport vesicles and all other minuscule but critical elements within a cell all conform to physical properties. But we have to start with the right basic chemicals. In order to show whether life could emerge naturally, scientists first had to show that the environment could have derived complex organic compounds out of relatively simple inorganic ingredients, and that this could have happened incidentally within that environment. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey created a sealed artificial atmosphere of water, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen, and they proved that when heated and electronically charged, these would produce amino acids, the building blocks of living proteins. They repeated the experiment with different gases according to different hypotheses for the atmosphere of the prebiotic Earth, and all of them produced amino acids. One of these experiments, called the volcano in a bottle, used chemicals common in volcanic eruptions: carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfur dioxide. That experiment turned out to produce 22 amino acids and a few other organic molecules. Shortly thereafter, Sidney Fox studied the spontaneous formation of peptides, short chains of amino acid monomers, and he demonstrated that as they dried, they developed into long strings called polypeptides, becoming increasingly complex. Then it was discovered that these could even form in outer space. Fragments of the Murchison meteorite, a 4.5 billion-year-old chondrite that fell to Australia in 1969, were found to contain a great many different types of as-yet unidentified molecules of extreme complexity, in addition to simple organic molecules such as sugars, lipids, and nitrogenous bases. It was also found to contain more than 80 amino acids some in large amounts. With that established, scientists then had to show how the most important ingredient came about, the extremely complex macromolecule known as DNA. There's another version of genetics called RNA, and activated RNA actually builds DNA. Some viruses don't have DNA, but they do have RNA, and this led many scientists to hypothesize life beginning in an RNA world. RNA and DNA are both made of many times repeated components called nucleotides. It took a while, but researchers have shown how RNA nucleotides could have formed naturally in conditions now expected of the prebiotic Earth. In 2009, organic chemist John Sutherland at the University of Manchester showed how a specific cocktail of relatively simple chemicals became increasingly complex after several cycles of repeated inundation, dehydration, and irradiation. Once the mix became sufficiently complex, after enough repetition, a plausible phosphate was introduced, and the mix spontaneously transformed into ribonucleotides, the precursor of nucleic acids, the building blocks of RNA and DNA. Dr. Sutherland remarked that his laboratory conditions were like the warm little pond which Darwin speculated might be how life first emerged, provided that pond evaporated, got heated, and then it rained, and then the sun shone. Interestingly, the pathway from simple chemistry to complex chemistry to basic biology involves multiple mediums, repeatedly heating and cooling, dousing and drying. This is generally expected to be in solution, optimally near underwater geothermal vents or in volcanic pools near a shoreline. Other scientists had already shown that by dripping solutions of amino acids or RNA nucleotides onto a particular type of clay, it produced polymers. Nucleotide precursors spontaneously assembled into RNA strands, even without the help of enzymes or ribosomes. Another team of researchers at Harvard showed how RNA could even duplicate itself without the normally necessary enzyme. An enzyme is a catalytic molecule which reacts to other molecules performing certain functions. They can metabolize food in digestion, or they can help rapidly replicate macromolecules, or make new copies of RNA. In fact, the enzyme itself is actually made of RNA. When double-stranded RNA is heated and divides, one strand contorts into a ribosome and the other becomes a template to be copied. Within the field of abiogenesis research, also known as prebiotic chemistry, there are literally dozens of concordant hypotheses, almost all of which could be true at the same time. Scientists have even composed protocells with some degree of metabolic processes, something similar to the hypothesized hypercycle. So it seems like the whole hypothesis has already been substantiated, but not quite yet. What I'm saying now is a super simple summary of something that is really crazy complex. There is still the question of how such protocells would grow and divide without all of the components we know of from modern cells, which of course the most primitive cells might not even need. That, and some people want to see the whole collection of processes as a single experiment where basic chemicals are poured in and something like bacteria comes out. We're not quite there yet. But speaking personally, what has always inspired me about science wasn't what was already known, but whatever we still don't know or haven't yet shown, because that's where new scientists, perhaps even you, might contribute or discover something profound.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. That was profound. Now, those are facts. That's reality. That's life. That's reality, I guess. Where are we going to go now is into the world of fiction. Apocalyptic fiction, maybe? Whatever you want to call these what am I trying to say? The Bible stories, essentially. Today, we're going to focus on the most fictional of them all, and that's the book of Revelation. Now, it's not me that's going to be doing the talking, and it's not a Christian who's going to be doing the talking. There is a show, there's a podcast, I should say, sorry, it's not a show. And it's called The History in the Bible. Looks like that. And sometimes they look like that in terms of the the cover image. Okay, I kind of like the first one better. Yeah, I like that one better, so we'll use that one. Now it's a two-parter. Let me get back up here. So it's a two-parter. The first part is 30 minutes, and I think without any further ado, we should get into it. Let's play and enjoy, because this should be fun.
Hello, I'm Gary Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles.
Welcome back to our next part of our Gary and Steve's Guide to the Apocalypse. Today we are talking about the book of Revelation, the major Christian apocalypse, and the one apocalypse that made it into the official biblical canon of nearly every Christian group. I guess you could say every Christian group has Revelation in its canon, well, except for one. And we might as well talk about that now. Every single group except for the Assyrian Church of the East includes the Book of Revelation in their official canon. The Catholics, Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Anglicans, and just about every Protestant group has Revelation in its official Bible.
And the Ethiopians have it.
The Ethiopians have it as well. And today we're going to talk about Revelation and how it's organized and how it's interpreted, which that can be very interesting indeed, and also how it came about and where it came from, because that's a story in and of itself. So Gary, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Steve, and yourself?
I'm great, and I'm really glad to get together again to do this apocalypse talk. It's coming sooner or later. We're getting to the apocalypse here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Lots of apocalypses.
Lots of apocalypses. Who knows what will happen after the elections? There's always an apocalypse around the corner.
And this apocalypse is called the Apocalypse Revelation, is also called the Revelation of St. John, or it has several different names, but it was written by a John, and traditionally that John is associated with John the Apostle, one of Jesus's initial followers. And the Revelations, as we learn through talking about the apocalypse of Adam and Daniel, it's when someone is getting a direct message from God about what's happening, either what's happened already or what's going to happen in the future. It's a direct connection, and somebody seeing what's going to happen in the end. It's an eschatological book. Now, the story of John starts with Jesus. We'll back it up to there. And John could have been the author of the book of John, which is a canonical gospel, as well as the letters of John that are also canonical in the New Testament scripture. But there is some debate about that, because, Gary, isn't everything debatable when you're talking about the Bible?
Everything is completely debatable. One thing that struck me is that the earlier the texts in Christianity, the more likely they are to be anonymous. And scholars have to try and figure out, well, who actually wrote these? It's sort of the later texts that start saying, yes, my name is Petrinus, and this is my gospel. But hardly any of those actually made it into the canonical New Testament. So the early ones, like the four Gospels, they are anonymous. None of them declare their authorship. It's only starting with, I think, the Gospel of John mentions John. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing.
And that's really where we get into John big time. In the beginning of the book of Revelation, it says that this was written by John on Patmos, which is an island off of the coast of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And there's a couple of different dates. The generally accepted date that the book was written is in the mid-90s AD. But a lot of scholars think that the original ideology or creation of the idea, the revelation, if you will, happened in the 60s AD. And there's a lot to back that up that we will get into. But the book wasn't actually written down onto parchment or papyrus or however they wrote it down about 20 to 30 years later by a John, and it might not have actually been the same John. And this is something that we've talked about in the past about authorship, and that if somebody wrote in the school or the same way that another author wrote, that they would give the authorship. It's kind of like Stephen King. If Stephen King was dead and somebody continued to write Stephen King-like novels, they wouldn't say, well, this is a book inspired by Stephen King. They would have just said it was by Stephen King, especially if it was maybe one of Stephen King's close editors who was carrying on. You know, it's actually an author who that happens with a lot is Dr. Seuss.
Oh.
There's a lot of books that they're licensed and they put like the Dr. Seuss logo on there, but they're by somebody else.
Oh, really?
And they're generally not as clever as his books.
Right. Okay.
And
That's
I think
hilarious.
that's maybe what happened with John, that the original John had some great ideas, but they wound up in an editor's hands who maybe wasn't quite as clever or didn't have quite as clear of a vision as John did.
Yes, I mean, your book's going to sell a lot better if it's associated with someone famous from the past, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that that's a lot of ways for people to say, oh, well, just discount the book. It doesn't count if John didn't actually write it down himself. But
Got a point.
what was actually writing back then? Did John have a first draft that he passed on to this other guy who maybe added 10%? Is it not John's anymore?
Oops. Oops. Oops, sorry about that. I pressed something and I shouldn't have. What an idiot. What an idiot. Now what's going on?
But and they're generally not as clever.
In that the Apostle John did write something, say, in the 60s, the core of the book. And then, well, there may have been a school of people, the Johannine school, I think they're called, who evolved it over the decades, like the school of Aristotle or Plato or something.
Or even think about it like modern day politicians. They crank out a book that was ghost written and they don't even give the ghostwriter credit.
Yeah. Or royalties.
Yeah. But I think it's of what authorship means exactly is kind of a fuzzy thing, and it's much fuzzier back then.
Oh, yeah, much fuzzier. I mean, from what I gather, it was a well-established convention in the classical world, certainly, that you could adopt someone else's name as sort of, it was almost taken for granted.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the early Christians had a hard time deciding if a book was by Paul or if it was Pauline.
Yeah.
And they had a serious issue then of sorting that out.
Yeah, that's true. It's sort of like some of those Renaissance painters who founded schools, isn't it? Is it a real Caravaggio or is it by one of his school? Does it matter that much?
Yeah, that's a big thing in the art world, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, definitely if the artist had his vision and he passed it on to disciples who painted in his style, who he trained.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the sculptor Rodin, I think this story is true. You know, like the famous sculptor, The Thinker. Apparently Rodin only ever made miniatures. And then he passed it on to his colleagues. And they actually made the full-size version. He didn't.
So he was the idea man and they were the craftsmen.
Yeah, exactly. He was the idea man. He said, okay, make a big one that looks just like this. And they did.
Yeah, that opens up a Pandora's box of what's.
I just oops, I just stopped it because I wanted to show you that that your best buddy, Mr. Batman, is about to start a study. How do I do this? A study of the Book of Revelation. See? Study of the Book of Revelation. Oops. There you go. Study of the Book of Revelation. He should be starting in a few minutes. So this is kind of running concurrently. But he's going to be studying it from the illogical kind of side, right? And we are going to be listening to the truth about Revelation. I'm going to be keeping an eye on Mr. Batman and see what's happening there. But if you want to hear the truth, here it is. If you want to hear the nonsense interpretation, which you will hear in spades from Mr. Batman, then that's the guy to listen to. But for now, let's just carry on. And oops, no one down one. All right, let's get it going. Get going. There we go.
When people are collaborating, I don't know if that's a Western mindset that one person has to do something and their name gets put on it, and that's the person who did it, and anything that isn't is inauthentic.
Yeah. Does seem like a very Western thing, doesn't it?
Not that I know how the Chinese do it or anything, but I think it seems Western.
Mm. Particularly in sort of big amorphous and complex works like movies or something. If the original director sort of leaves halfway through, and some other director takes over, which seems to be pretty common from what I can gather, is it the original director's work? Is it following his vision? So I suppose it'd be the same with these manuscripts.
And so and it's probably confusing that maybe that editor was John of Patmos. Mm. That's where one of the controversies comes up, is that Patmos is it's a small island right off the coast of Asia Minor. I believe it's within seeing distance of the mainland.
This is what we're listening to.
And
oh, okay.
It's maybe 20 miles. I don't know. Don't quote me on that.
Yep.
But it's that doesn't really matter. It's close. Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of islands that are really close. And it's very close to the city of Ephesus, which was gigantically important for early Christianity.
Oh, yes.
And that's traditionally where John the Apostle is said to have died and lived most of his life post Jesus times, was in Ephesus.
Okay.
One of the common stories is that Patmos was almost like a prison colony of the Romans, where people were kept for indeterminate amount of time, sort of like a Devil's Island, or not for nothing, Australia of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Small version of Australia.
But that might not necessarily be true. It is possible that during a localized persecution, or a time where they wanted to separate a troublemaker like John, they may have just shoved him off to Patmos to keep him away from his followers.
Okay, so that'd be like the Roman convention of exiling people to some dumpy little island somewhere.
Because the archaeology that I've looked at doesn't back up that it was a penal colony. There was a big town on Patmos that was a trading center. It had agriculture. It doesn't fit what you would maybe generally think as a penal colony or as a prison island. And not that kind of changes the whole idea, and that's where I think
sorry. So what we're going to do is we'll probably switch in, depending how entertaining Mr. Big Mouth is. We'll probably switch between the two, because pretty soon these guys are going to get into the Book of Revelation after the introduction, and then we're going to get introduced into the reality of what this fictional, or this attempted fiction is. But in the meantime, let's just wait another 15 seconds and see if Mr. Batman actually turns up. Kind of hoping he will. 9! That's incorrect. So we can probably review this at the same time. This is going to be a fun. Oh, there he is. He's already. Look at him. Let me see if I can get him in there a bit better. Let's see what he's doing. Okay, let me get myself out of there and see what old Batty Batman's doing. Come on, Mr. Battyman, what are you doing? Hello? Hello, Mr. Batman. Hello? You're online. You're live. So what if he's live? We'll just carry on listening. Fuck this guy. We'll just carry on listening.
When I initially read it, I read through it 2 times, Revelation, and it made 0 sense to me.
Yeah.
Yes. 0 sense, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely no sense.
You should try First Enoch. That's 100 chapters.
Wow.
Well, and that's where
Hello.
that's where Revelation comes in, is that it's so chocked full of Old Testament references. Basically, every line is a reference to something in the Old Testament, making it probably the most Jewish book of the whole New Testament canon.
Yeah, you'll find huge chunks of stuff which has obviously been inspired by the wackiness in Ezekiel and Daniel, scattered throughout the whole book. If you removed all those references and that material, you'd probably only have 4 out of the 22 chapters left.
I was really shocked digging more into this. I think, well, all those books, like there's books of Ezekiel that you can't even read in a family podcast.
Yeah.
And that's I think the shocking part. Isn't there something, there was a proverb with rabbis that you shouldn't even study Ezekiel until you're 30 years old?
That's right, yes. I think the first 2 chapters of Ezekiel you're not meant to touch until you're already a master rabbi. And you know your way around the whole Old Testament. It was held to be sort of dangerous, subversive, or crazy.
Oh, I'll take crazy.
I think that's what a lot of those books, like Enoch and Ezekiel and Daniel, they're like playing with fire. And that's what Revelation really turns into, is that if when people start interpreting it outside of its context, it just all goes downhill very quickly.
I'd agree with that. I mean, Revelation has a centuries-long tradition of being interpreted by the people of whatever time who are reading it as pertaining to their times, making some sorts of prediction about the imminent end of the world, when in fact you really do have to look at it as a product of a certain community who seem to have had the codings or the secret knowledge to be able to interpret it.
The book was... The initial part of the book is John has a revelation, or he's visited by Jesus, who asks him to write letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, which are...
the 7 churches are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, which is Sparta, I think,
No,
And
not
those are
necessarily.
those are gigantic, important cities,
Lacedaemonium,
except
it
for
was.
Thyatira. I'd never heard of that one. But Pergamum was a gigantic, important city.
Yeah, that was
Sardis, Ephesus, Laodicea, all of them were really important cities. But it's kind of interesting that the cities that they didn't mention, like Chalcedon doesn't get mentioned, and that was a city, or Nicaea, or Ancyra, which were also important cities at the time. It's kind of interesting that those that there were some cities that were left out, that they're pretty specific geographically. They're all very close to each other in Asia Minor.
Yeah, actually, I might just give a quote from one of the letters to, say, Ephesus, just to give you a bit of a taste of the book. This is Revelations 2:1, and he writes, "To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance, but I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Remember then from what you have fallen, repent, and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent." So that's a typical paragraph about the church. He's talking to them, he says, love your work, guys, but there's a few little problems here. And he's also throwing in this image of a golden lampstand.
Okay, let me just switch over to Jim, see what he's up to, because I do believe he started talking. Oops. All right. Jumbo, where are you, buddy? There he is.
Up those 7 spirits. There are 7 spirits of God. They're also mentioned again in Revelation chapter 4, verse 5. "And from Yeshua Messiah, who is the faithful witness and the first begotten of the dead, and the prince of the kings of the earth, unto him that loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood." That's Daniel chapter 7, verse 10.
Oh my God, this is horrible.
13 and 1
Horrible. Sorry, I'd rather listen to these other guys personally. So let's get them in. Let's get them back to business.
And walking amongst the 7 golden lampstands. And that's a classic Revelation thing. And I think, the casual reader, you're reading it, and it's obvious he's writing, a letter to the congregation in Ephesus, but what on earth are the golden lampstands? The answer is we don't know.
And that's a great place to dive into the context
We don't know.
that a lot of the things that we'll be talking about is we're trying to maybe pull together a lot of different theories that are going on around there. There's almost an infinite amount of theories on the context and the interpretation of this book. But one thing is that this is a very Jewish book, and it was directed to the Jewish congregations of Asia Minor in a very specific context.
Yeah, I think it's really worth emphasizing just how Jewish it is. The whole book is well in the long tradition by then of Jewish apocalyptic and cryptic works. There's nothing which really distinguishes it from them. There are references to Jesus, but they're really pretty vague. There's only one reference, I think, in the whole book to the historic Jesus, the guy who came down and lived on earth. All the other references are to these various heavenly or celestial figures, which fit right in with other celestial figures from the Jewish literature. If you just eliminated the name Jesus or the Lord, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, really, to a normal Jewish apocalyptic work.
And I think it's interesting to hear exactly how John describes Jesus in the first chapter in verse 12, where he says, quote, "I turned around to see a voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw the 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. That does not sound like the 4 canonical Gospels Jesus.
No, not at all. In fact, it sounds a lot like Daniel. May I quote Daniel? Daniel 7:9. As I looked on, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garment was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like lamb's wool. Now let's leap to Daniel 10:5. I looked and saw a man dressed in linen, his loins girt in fine gold. His body was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and legs had the colour of burnished bronze. It's straight out of Daniel.
Yeah, and it's really trying to make that connection to the Old Testament and to the Old Covenant books. That's an Old Testament description. That's refocusing Jesus completely as an Old Testament God. And that's really the first step a lot believe in of really the birth of the Trinity, is making Jesus as God in there.
Yes, I think one thing to mention, the phrase the Son of Man. Son of Man seems to have been a standard Hebrew term which simply meant human being, person. It has no connotations of divinity. In fact, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, when he's taking on this the Son of Man, it's almost like they're taking that vocabulary that everyone was comfortable with and they're reimagining it or refocusing it.
Yeah, investing in it with a wholly new significance.
That's what I think that is really interesting, is that the whole book, feeling that it was written for a Jewish audience who was really steeped in all of this language. They would have known Ezekiel, they would have known Daniel, they would have known Hosea, they would have known all those things inside and out. And this person is writing almost in a code to them.
Yes, and it assumes the audience is at least vaguely familiar with the code. But I think if you had been, say, a Gentile Christian, a Roman Christian, you'd have had no idea what he was talking about.
Yeah, I think that that's what the book is really trying to do, essentially, is to convince Jews that this new idea of Judaism is the real way to go. To me, that's what this book is trying to do, is that they're writing to the Jews of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, that this new idea of Judaism is the one that you should be getting on board on.
Yes, because it has so much in common with what you already know. Would be the message, I suppose.
And that kind of makes sense if John is pulling these ideas together in the 60s, the late 60s, 70s. Remember that the larger context was that the Jewish wars was going on in the Middle East, in the area around Syria and Palestine, that if you live there, you would probably think the end of the world was coming. 4 or 5 Roman legions are going into towns and killing everyone and destroying the towns.
Yes.
And then ultimately in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, completely razed to the ground, if you were a Jewish person living there, that's the end of the world.
That's apocalypse.
Yeah, that is the end of the world. The ancient temple, the seat of God's presence, is gone. It'd be literally the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not literally. Okay, all right.
You probably think it was coming.
You probably think it was coming. You probably think that this truly was the end of times.
However,
there's that spiritual element in that idea that the world was coming to the end when the temple was destroyed. But then there's also there's a lot of ideas out there that this was talking about persecution of early Christians. But to me, it almost sounds like if you were thinking there was towns in Syria like Tyre, where all the Jews were taken from the town and slaughtered. That's persecution.
Oh, yeah.
And the Romans probably weren't asking questions. Well, are you a Second Temple follower who thinks Jesus is the Messiah, but he's not divine? Oh, you're one who thinks that Jesus is divine and the Messiah. I don't think that Centurion was coming in and asking those questions.
No, he wouldn't be going through the theological fine points, would he now? No, just pull out his sword.
And then a whole town is wiped out. That's the mindset to put this book into. And it's interesting when we get into more detail, the numerology, or this book is just chocked full of using numbers to mean things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the number 7 pops up quite a lot. 7 days in the week, there were 7 known planets, 7 angels,
7 lampstands,
7 lampstands,
7 stars,
7 stars, there's the 7 trumpets.
And then the number 12 and multiples of 12 come up a lot.
Yeah, 7 and 12 were the Israelites' favourite Powerball picks, I think.
They talk a lot about numbers, and then they talk a lot about another number that comes up big time is the number 1000 and the millennium.
That's true. There's 1,000 years, and of course there's 144,000 people who are going to be saved. I always wondered where the Jehovah's Witnesses got that from.
That's an interesting one. One of the commentators that I read, a modern commentator, said that he met a Jehovah's Witness, and this guy was a full Jehovah's Witness, and he said the 12,000 or the 144,000 is completely filled up already.
All right.
Of the actual saved. And that's, I think, to me, that's where when you start getting into this as a literal interpretation, what's 144,000? That's a neighborhood in people's, in most major metropolises around the world. That's not a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. No, that's not a lot of people.
But if you rewind to the 60s AD, a number like 144,000 is almost an unimaginable number.
That's true. It would have been a decent city, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And just the number 1,000 was actually shorthand for a lot.
Yeah.
You got 1,000 of something, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Nobody had 1,000 sheep. A government would probably have like 1,000 talents of gold.
Yeah.
Or 1,000 numista, or your average person did not have that kind of money. 1,000 of something was a lot of something.
Mm. That's true. The only things you'd be counting in thousands would be grains of sand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you certainly wouldn't have 1,000 sheep. You wouldn't have 1,000 houses. You wouldn't have 1,000 servants.
And 1,000 starting to get outside of what a person can actually comprehend.
Yeah. I suppose it'd be something like the word billion.
Yeah. It's really shorthand for a big number. And that's what a lot of these things in Revelation are. It's shorthand, or it's just layer upon layer of figurative language. That's what I found in trying to read all this, and what could you take as an analogy today to try and tie it back to. And I think that's what really starts to make interpretation of this book so difficult. There's really nothing to get a handhold of.
Yeah. Do you want to bring in the crossword puzzle analogy now? I thought that was really good.
Oh, you know what? That was I actually did think of one analogy as I know the New York Times crossword puzzle is probably the one that's most popular in the U.S., but I think maybe the Times of London is one that has a crossword puzzle.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And when you pick that up, if you're not used to that, you probably won't get one clue right, because it's so much of knowing what the language of the clues are and the way they ask the questions. Like my father-in-law, actually, he can do the whole thing in a couple of minutes because he's done them so long. He knows why they say certain things certain ways.
Yeah, apparently it's sort of a giant secret club, and you have to read the clues. I must admit, I've taken a look at some of these cryptic crossword puzzles and the subsequent answers, and I'm thinking, what? How did you get that? It's a vast coded system, and as you say, if you know the tricks, if you know the coding, It seems to be almost obvious, but to the rest of us, it's just, what?
And then imagine trying to use that to interpret how to live your life.
Oh, yeah, you're right. That's a good analogy, yes. Yeah. Today's crossword puzzle predicts tomorrow's future, and this is what I shall do to prepare for it. Okay.
So we've come to the conclusion you can possibly live your life by interpreting crossword puzzles. Maybe I would have made some better life choices if I had. Next time, we'll get into the schools of interpretation and the theology of the book of Revelation.
So join us next time for that great, mysterious book.
Next time. Okay. So next time. Oops. Next time, what they're going to do is talk about the actual book of Revelation, it seems. I'm going to get myself all organized here. Hold on a second. I mean, a bit of a tizzy. There we go. Grounded. Right. So, that was pretty much a kind of a primer on the Revelation, but now we're going to go right into it. So, let's go back to Gary and Steve. Bring them in, and we'll go back to Mr. Batman at the same time.
Hello, I'm Gary Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles.
Let's dive right in and start looking at how the book of Revelation was and is interpreted. The book crams in just about every figurative and allegorical method you can use in literature.
And also we're going to dive into Revelation's very deep roots in all the apocalyptic and Old Testament literature.
So we can really only hope to scratch the surface here, but it's a good start.
Oh, yeah.
It is a good start. And if you can make more sense of Revelation than we can, it probably won't be too hard, please email.
Generally,
Jim
there's three schools of the
that.
way that the book is interpreted. There's the preterist, the historical, and the futurist. The preterist is saying that all of this was basically it all happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
The historical is saying that some of it's happened in the past and some of it's imminent. What imminent means is up for interpretation. And then the futurist is saying that none of it's happened yet. It's all going to happen in the future. And the futurist is where you would get things like the Left Behind book series, Rapture, even though the Rapture doesn't come directly from the book of Revelation, it's that whole idea comes from interpreting Revelation as a handbook of what's going to happen.
Yes, and of course it depends when you're writing. I think Revelation during the Napoleonic Wars was interpreted as predicting Napoleon and the end of the world. And of course today a lot of people still read it like that, saying the world's going to end real soon.
Sacramental Christians like the Eastern Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox, like the Copts and the Catholics and the Anglicans, they interpreted almost completely in the historical and the preterist camps, with a little bit of futurists dabbled in there, where when you start getting into the Protestants, they're teaching it more, and not all of them. It's with the Protestants, it's always difficult to nail one interpretation in there, but a lot of the wackier interpretations are taking it completely literally and in the futurist. Like when we get that there's only 144,000 people who will go to heaven, that's taking it very literally and in the future.
Yes, the sacramental churches seem to go out of their way to minimize Revelation. I was just looking at the Revised Common Lectionary, which seems to be a modern set of readings which have been adopted by quite a number of major Protestant denominations. And the readings which they've adopted in the yearly cycle of readings are completely atypical of Revelation, and they've got the nice bits. And I'll give you an example. Here's Revelation 22:12, and this is in the lectionary. See, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, to repay according to everyone's work. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they will have the right to the tree of life, and may enter the city by the gates. It is I, Jesus, who sent my angel to you with this testimony for the churches. I am the root and descendant of David, the bright morning star. Now, those are the verses in the lectionary, but they've omitted a verse in the middle there, and they've omitted it for a very good reason. Now, just listen to this. This is verse 15. Outside are the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So they've dropped that from the lectionary because it's a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah, and the ones that made it into the lectionary are so vanilla.
Yeah, they're vanilla. But from what I can gather, the Episcopal churches find Revelation a little bit of an embarrassment.
Generally, the Western Christians, the Roman Catholics and the Protestants, are more accepting of Revelation as a teaching document. I guess that's something that the four canonical Gospels and then the epistles or the letters are really, they're a manual for Christianity, for the religion. They're the way that they teach people what the religion's about, where Revelation is tricky to use it as a teaching tool directly. The Catholics use it, and they're pretty much, when they include it in their readings lists, are pretty much the vanilla chapters and verses.
Yeah.
The Eastern Orthodox do not include it at all in their weekly readings. I guess that's something that maybe not everybody is aware of. Most churches have a set list of readings that they do on certain days, certain Sundays, and it follows a pattern. You can look it up online, and that's very accessible. And especially amongst the Christians, like the sacramental ones, I think it's laid out to infinity of how this is the Sunday of da-da-da-da-da, and this is the gospel that's read, and this is the epistle that's read. I think in a lot of evangelical and Protestant traditions, the individual pastors given a little bit more license on what they're able to read, but that's, we could probably talk about that for 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
The Eastern Orthodox do not read that book at all during their reading cycle. The Copts in the Oriental Orthodox Communion read the whole entire book in one day, 6 days after Easter. And then, like we said, the Assyrian Orthodox don't include it in their canon, so they're not reading it at all.
That, yes, what's the name of that day again, Steve? What is it?
It is called Apocalypse Night. Isn't that a name and a half? Apocalypse Night?
Apocalypse Night. I mean, if it was the first time you'd ever heard of it, you'd be going, what? Oh, Mum, do we have to go to this?
That sounds like something that they would do around Halloween time.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Seems a bit of a funny place for us. What, first Saturday after Easter?
In amongst the Orthodox, the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox, that week after Easter is called Bright Week.
Oh, okay.
In Bright Week, there's no fasting on the usual fasting days, and it's pretty much it's a time to let your hair down after Lent.
Oh, like Mardi Gras.
Yeah. Or what do they have in Dingus Day and
what
amongst the Eastern Europeans?
Dingus Day?
It's the Monday after Easter where you just completely go all out. It's not celebrated as much in Poland now as it is in the diaspora of Poles.
Oh, okay.
But it's a tradition. I don't know if that's something that maybe communism tamped down on.
Right.
But it's I happen to live in a place that has a lot of Polish immigrants to it.
Oh, okay.
But it's one of those. It's a celebration after the fast, and that's kind of what Bright Week is. So I almost wonder if that reading of Apocalypse on the last day of Bright Week's kind of trying to rein you back in.
I think that'd be a very effective downer at the end of the week, wouldn't it? Geez, you wouldn't want to go there if you're bombed out of your brain, would you? Where are we? What? Ah!
It's not a terribly long book, but to read it straight through would be 3-4 hours.
And it'd be a tricky book to read because it's not straight narrative, which you can follow quite easily. There's so much crazy imagery in it.
Yeah, it doesn't follow the standard narrative arc that we're accustomed to in English writing style, where it's building up, there's a climax, and then it goes towards a conclusion. There's a lot of building up and climax, and then it goes down and up and down. That's what I felt like reading it, going through it that first time when I did. You would think, oh wow, it's going to end now, but then there's some more.
Yeah, then there's some more. Yeah. There's the visions of the 7 bowls. You're thinking, well, that was pretty heavy. Now we have the 7 trumpets. Oh no, it keeps going. Oh.
And a lot of the things that I thought were going to be really heavy, like the 4 horsemen, wasn't quite as heavy as I thought it would be.
No, that's true, actually. In popular culture, we've picked out a lot of images, like the 4 horsemen, which aren't really that important in the book, are they? I mean, they're there, but they aren't, apocalyptic in a sense. Like the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls go on for chapters. But the 4 horsemen is just 1 or 2 paragraphs, I think.
The 4 horsemen is a great chapter that's been interpreted many different ways. And I think it's almost a part of the common lexicon. That's what people think of, like, whoa, the stuff's hitting the fan when the 4 horsemen come. But the common interpretation is the white horse comes, and that's actually Jesus. And if for the preterists and the historicals school, that's when Jesus comes in the 30s AD, and then all the other ones come. There's the fiery red horse, and then there's the one that can kill people with the sword, and there's war and pestilence and all that stuff. That's the things that are saying that on earth it's going to be pretty crappy, for Jesus came, but with all that, there's these other horsemen that were always there. It's kind of a way of saying that there's still, Jesus is coming again, and you better bunker down for that time when Jesus isn't here, because there's those other 3 horsemen.
Yeah, it's the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse. Damn, that ruins everything.
Yeah, when you take that first horseman out, it becomes not quite as exciting.
Yes, Steve, just to show how connected Revelation is with the Old Testament. The horseman mentioned in chapter 6 of Revelation also comes straight out of Zechariah. Now, I'm going to quote from Zechariah 1:8 and Zechariah 6:1. And here's what the prophet Zechariah says. In the night I had a vision. I saw a man mounted on a bay horse, standing among the myrtles in the deep, and behind him were bay, sorrel, and white horses. I looked up again, and I saw 4 chariots were coming out from between the 2 mountains. The mountains were of copper. The horses of the first chariot were bay. The horses of the second chariot were black. The horses of the third chariot were white. And the horses of the 4th chariot were spotted, dappled. So there's another image in Revelation which is tied completely to Zechariah, And presumably the early community which was listening to Revelation would have gone, oh yeah, Zechariah, of course.
And there again, that's really what they're aiming. That's what that writer of Revelation is. He's aiming it at this Jewish community, saying, come on, guys, let's get on board already. I thought that this is a good time to talk about there's 4 horsemen, but that number, the numbers keep coming up time and time again, especially like you said, that number 7. And the number 7, as far as I've researched, it represents perfection. Does that have any throwbacks to the Old Testament, that number 7? What I read was that it's like 7 days of creation.
I think it must tie into that. Offhand, I can't think. I know the number 7 does appear a lot in the Old Testament. I mean, 7 days of the week, it's the classic thing, I suppose, isn't it? A Jubilee, which is 7 times 7, 49 years. And from what I understand, the Israelites got the number 7 from the Babylonians, I think.
Well, was it 6 days of creation, 6 days, and then the 7th was...
That's right, he rests.
That comes into where we quoted it earlier, where Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. That ties in with the message, again, of saying that Jesus was divine and the Logos, the creative force, because Alpha was the first letter of the Greek alphabet, A. Omega was actually the last letter of the Greek alphabet, not Z or Z. Alpha the first, so he's the beginning and the end. Jesus is there at creation and he's there at judgment, the beginning and the end.
Yeah, Revelation 1:8. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty.
The Greeks took the Phoenician alphabet, and the Phoenician alphabet was all consonants, because the way it was transcribed, vowels weren't quite as important, and that's where the like a lot of times with like the Old Testament scrolls that Jews read at their services or in Arabic writing, it's just vowels are marked off with little dots. They're called diacritics. Where in Indo-European languages like Greek, vowels are much more important. And when they needed vowels, they invented these couple of vowels, omega, which is omega, the big O, and then there's omicron, micro, with different sounds. And what they did is they just took those and lumped them on and stuck them at the end. And over the course of several thousand years, they kind of filtered out into the rest of our alphabet.
Yes, when it got changed into the Latin. I mean, the Romans adapted the Greek alphabet for their own use, didn't they? And with some Etruscan influence, I think.
Yeah, but so Jesus is saying in there that he's the beginning, the end. He was there in the creation, and he'll be there at the end of days. And that's clearly making him a divine figure.
It is making him a divine figure, but not that much more divine than anything you'll find like in, say, First Enoch. It's a matter of whether divine in the sense of angelic or divine in the sense of Son of God.
We'll go into that quickly before we go into numerology, is the use of the word angel. This comes up time and time again where John is referencing the angel of Ephesus, and the angel is actually considered... That was what they would have called the bishop of a city, is angel. Right. Back then, a lot of terms were used a little bit more loosely than they are now. They talk about elders, which in Greek was presbyteros, which we get our term priest from. But at that earliest time, there really wouldn't have been a big difference between priests and bishops. And so when he's writing that letter to the angels, he's really specifically saying that he's writing to the bishops or the head of the Christian community in each of those cities. And when they talk, he also references in there that he talks to an angel that's very specifically meant to identify Jesus. it gets that's one of the parts that gets very confusing for interpretation. Is he talking to an angelic being, or is he talking to Jesus?
Yes, and I wonder how much that sort of confusion or mishmash was in the minds of the community at that time.
Yeah, was it intentional mishmash, or was it something that we're missing?
Yeah, was it something that we're missing? Because now we're seeing it after almost 2,000 years. And we have very sharply demarcated concepts of Jesus as Son of God versus just an angel. But in those days, who knows what they thought.
Another part of it is that they would often use the word, it gets translated as saints, but saint was another thing that wasn't. Now we have the idea, if you say somebody, oh, Saint George or Saint this or that, it's a very specific thing, I think, that comes in most people's minds, that they've gone through like an investigation for their sainthood, and they've but saint just really comes from the word sanctus, holy. And back then, somebody who was even alive might have been called a saint. It was just somebody who was living up to the holy tradition that they were expected to live to. They didn't even necessarily have to be dead to be called a saint.
Right. I suppose, if in medieval times, I'm thinking, how vain would you have to be to accept that face on? If someone said, oh, Saint so-and-so, how are you? I'm fine, and
I almost wonder if it was a different a mindset. Like if you saw a monk who lived the lifestyle, oh, they're holy so-and-so. It didn't carry quite the same level that we did. Like I would think that a lot of people would say like Mother Teresa was holy in her life, but you wouldn't call her Saint Teresa while she was still alive before she went through the process. I think she went through the process.
Yeah, I think it's the Pope. Has she been canonized, or is she on the verge of being canonized?
I thought she did with John Paul II. They may have gotten canonized right around the same time.
Right. John Paul went out of his way to make saints, didn't he? I think he made a huge number of them.
Yeah, somebody who you would think that, then, oh, yeah, that's a great guy. He's holy. You'd say he was holy. Where, now it's taken on a different meaning than it carried at that time. And that's a big part of that whole book, is that things have taken on different meanings than they were intended to back then.
Yeah, things back then which were sort of designations are now formal titles.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get back into numerology. 12 is a huge number. The 12 tribes of Israel plus the 12 apostles. Those two 12s get us into a lot of the multiples of 12. So I don't know about you, but if you're going to read the Revelations, you better be able to multiply and divide the number 12 really, really quickly and really well. The number 144 comes out a lot. 12 12s. That's one of those really important numbers. Another important number that comes up is 666. That's another one that you may have heard of out there. Gary, what comes to your mind when you hear 666?
The beast, the end of times, the number of the beast.
Like in the Omen, didn't he have 666 on his head?
Yes, he did. The little kid had 666 on his head.
The sign of the beast.
The sign of the beast.
And that's one that people have a lot of fun with, like Mikhail Gorbachev, the prime minister of the Soviet Union. His birthmark kind of looked like a 666 if you looked at it a certain way and photoshopped it and Lord knows what else.
Right.
666, though, has a specific meaning. Now, some people think that it was a that people attach numbers to the as kind of a number and wordplay of people's names, and you could turn Nero Caesar's full name into 666 in that word game. I don't necessarily buy that one.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what if you did any research on that.
I think that's the most common interpretation of 666, that it stands for Nero. And some scholars note that in some manuscripts the number is given as 616, which would also fit Nero if you drop the final Hebrew letter nun from Neron or Neron, whatever, however you'd pronounce it in Hebrew, into Nero. I don't know other interpretations. What have you got on that?
Another interpretation is
Sounds
that
like a
666
scam.
is an imperfection of 7.
Ah,
That's 7. 7 take away 1. Jesus in a trinity gives you 666. So it's really just a shorthand for imperfection.
oh, okay.
Which kind of fits in more because Nero, after it's all said and done, wasn't that bad of a guy. He wasn't that bad of a guy to the Jews. He was there with the Jewish wars, but I don't think he was really that concerned with it. The real bad guys in the Jewish wars were Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian.
That's true. They were the generals who actually led the legions.
Different interpretations have had it that Nero persecuted Christians after the Great Fire of Rome. But if you read, there's a great book by Stephen Dando Collins, and he really gets into that. At that time, it would have been very difficult for a Roman official to pinpoint something on Christians. I know there's a lot of things that I think it was in Livy, there was something, a reference to the Christos.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
They're not 100% sure if that wasn't maybe redacted later.
Yeah, or and I think I read somewhere that Christos was actually a moderately common Greek name. It didn't mean Christos or whatever. It was actually a personal name.
There's a lot of confusion in that. We'll leave it at that. A lot of confusion to say that there was a decent amount of Jewish people living in Rome, but even at that time, there weren't a ton of Christ-believing Jews in the city of Rome. For why would you specifically target them? It was either you were targeting Jews in general, and then there's even theories that Nero was actually persecuting followers of Isis.
Oh, right.
Not Isis, the Egyptian god. But that's getting kind of off base. But I think in general, Nero probably wasn't the ultimate fall guy here.
Right. I mean, yeah, in the mid or late 60s, I suppose, the Christian community would not have been distinguished amongst themselves from the Jews, would they? It was still very early years.
Yeah, you're talking 30 years after the fact.
Yep.
30 years and some change. I just don't think that, like you said, there would have been such a diversity of belief and a spectrum of belief that it would be very difficult for the Romans to come in and specifically target one group for persecution.
Yes.
I'm not saying that the myth of persecution, that's a book by, I believe her name was Candida Ross. I haven't read the whole book, but that's saying that Christians weren't really persecuted that bad, and it wasn't at that time, though. Christians being inside of this larger group of Second Temple Jews, which is where they fit, people were getting persecuted.
But probably unlikely because they were Christians.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, those are the big ones. That's chapter 6 is where the 4 angels of the Euphrates raise an army of the 2 million cavalry to kill a third of mankind. And then the angel of 7 sounded the trumpet, and hail and fire, blah blah blah, burning a third of the earth's plants, killing a third of the things in the ocean, and then a third of the stars' lights diminished.
Oh yeah, here we go. 8 verse 12. A third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars.
I like
this third comes up, 1/3 of something. Some examples of it are that in verse 12 of chapter 8, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. And 3 angels, a third of the living creatures in the seas died, and a third of the ships were destroyed, and a third of the trees were burned up, and the green grass was burned up. That third means an incompleteness. It means that it wasn't completely destroyed. It wasn't half destroyed either. It was something less than fullness of it. That's a big one. And then that we talked about that number 1,000 again, that it's all playing with words and playing with numbers. And that was something that the initial people who were this book was directly targeted to would have understood all of this. And it moves us into our next part. I remember Gary saying that he read the book and he interpreted that there would be a Belgian dog catcher who was the beast. Where do we get from a book that was really specifically targeted to an audience, and then it turns into something completely different? How does that happen?
Yes, I mean, in popular culture today, there have been any number of books which have apocalyptic themes from Revelation. There, particularly with the number of the beast and the end of the world and the Antichrist, if we just start with the Omens series. So, I mean, Revelation is possibly bigger in popular culture today than it has been in a while, and it's still around. Yeah, there's fascination with it.
I was thinking as I read through the book, it brought me back to when I had read the Divine Comedy in the Inferno, that that's very Revelation-like. That Dante is making, if you read the Inferno straight through, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you read the footnotes and you start to get these specific ideas, he was pulling a lot from Revelation in his book and where he was creating it. And especially when you pull, I think a lot of people stop with the Inferno, but if you carry on through to the Purgatorio and then the Paradise, it's very Revelation-like. So it's not just Left Behind and The Omen. This is a book that's really influenced Western thoughts since the earliest day.
Yes, in its own mysterious way. It's been endlessly fascinating, I suppose, because it's been so incredibly cryptic.
Yeah, that's probably the greatest thing with it, is that it's so cryptic. Another thing that struck me is that there's so much in there that heavily influences Catholic and Orthodox liturgy. And that's where it's come to be thought that it was actually a liturgical book. This is the first real example of, it's used several times, holy, 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 and this 3, that turns into eventually something that comes out of Middle Eastern Christianity called the Trisagion, the thrice holy. Holy is God, holy is mighty, holy is immortal. And those are actually taken straight out of the book. And that became big time around the 400s. Another thing is that there's this constant exhortation to come. It'll say, come hear this, come hear that. And that's something you'll hear very often in liturgical worship. And it carries through a liturgy where it's there's teaching, and then there's eschaton, and then it ultimately leads into the kingdom in that last chapter of the perfect of the second coming. And in those ways, it's very liturgical, and that's the way that the Catholics and the Orthodox see this book, as a very liturgical book.
Oh, okay.
And it almost can't be understood outside of that paradigm.
Right. I mean, the Protestants don't interpret it like that at all, do they? as a liturgical document. I mean, it appears as like hellfire and thunder.
Yeah, I think that they definitely take the eschatological parts of it.
Yeah.
But since they've really rejected so much of the liturgical,
Oh, that's a point, yes.
that they certainly wouldn't grab on to the liturgical aspects of it. One other thing that like we said, this layer of figurative language, like the great harlot and the beast who comes in as they use that, they say that the serpent in green and the harlot is red. It's using a lot of these like primary colors, and green was traditionally, especially during the Middle Ages, associated with evil.
Oh, was it?
Like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight,
Oh.
where green was representing evil. There's so much of that built into it that I don't think that, we could anywhere near scratch the surface of how many layers upon layers upon layers of figurative language they've built into this. I kind of feel like it was when I was in high school and read Shakespeare, and I couldn't understand the language, let alone that Shakespeare was really writing those so that the high-class educated people would get a certain message, but also the rabble got a message out of it.
Yeah, I must admit, even today, I find it almost impossible to read Shakespeare. I have to see it actually performed to get the language. And even then, my brain's running about 5 seconds behind the dialogue. And after my brain's processed it, I go, oh, geez, that was clever.
And while we're talking about the harlot, that's another one, the harlot or whore of Babylon. That ties into, I think it is Ezekiel 16 through 23.
17:1. One of the things about the book of Revelation, which makes it unique amongst the apocalypses, is its concern with female sexuality and women. It's not something you find in any of the other apocalypses. The harlot, the woman, who's usually associated with Rome, is a figure that just doesn't appear anywhere else. And I'll give you an example of the importance of this, one of the female figures. Well, actually, there's two important female figures in Revelation. The biggest one we have from Revelation 17:1. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came out and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of those fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk." So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. That's pretty full-on stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of that's interpreted as this whore is Israel who's cheating on God. It's not like a woman in particular. It's saying that they're painting this relationship between Israel is the bride, God's the groom, and God's heaped all this good stuff on her. In that chapter, didn't it say about the white linens and he's given her all this good stuff, and then she still goes and hangs out with Baal when he's at work. That's a theme that runs through some of these Old Testament groups, and then it goes into Revelation as well, that the scarlet harlot, who the harlot and the whore of Babylon could be specifically talking about a woman prophetess in one of the Asia Minor cities, the Nicolaitans, who they've mentioned, who they were doing kind of like a weird, like using sexual relations as like prophecy. It could be literal like that it was talking about something that was historical, or it could be saying that Israel, the Jewish people as a whole, have been cheating on God and that they need to get right. There's those two plays that the author could have actually have been kind of playing with both of them.
Yes, quite a number of the Old Testament prophets associate Israel as a bride who has cheated on God. So that pops up in quite a number of the prophets.
Yeah.
So there's that concept. But there certainly is one specific woman which John seems to be thinking of. In his letter to the church at Thyatira, in Revelations 2, he's writing to them, and to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, "These are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like a flame of fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze." And then John says, verse 2:19, "I know your works, your love, faith, service, and patient endurance. I know that your last works are greater than the first. But I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice fornication and to eat food sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her fornication. Beware, I am throwing her on a bed, and those who commit adultery with her I am throwing into great distress, unless they repent of their doing, and I will strike her children dead." So this Jezebel seems to be a real person in Thyatira that John has a really big beef with.
Yeah, and they think that they may have been tied into certain Gnostics.
Oh, okay.
A certain Gnostic group where there was a woman prophetess. And he may have been actually building layers of meaning in there, that you're talking about unfaithful Israel and this woman.
And equating the two.
And because it really, if you look at what Jesus said in the canonical Gospels, like in Luke, where Jesus anoints the sinful woman. Let's see, what version is this from? The New International Version. Jesus is eating with the Pharisees and the usual setup. And then he says a woman anoints Jesus's feet with oil and, is like repentant. And again, he calls out Simon. That's Simon Peter. He calls him out again for not anointing his feet. But this sinful woman she anoints his feet out of nowhere, and he forgives her and tells her to go and sin no more. So you're talking about a literal sinful woman there who Jesus has forgiven, as opposed to in Revelation where they're really calling out, this kind of prototypical sinful bride. It's kind of an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I mean, John really does have a thing about it, doesn't it? And as I said, it does appear in the Old Testament prophets, but not in the apocalyptic literature, the Jewish apocalyptic literature. So this is a new thing which John is throwing in for that genre.
Yeah, and I think that's where it kind of gets very difficult for biblical exegesis, where the Gospels, definitely the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, can be taken in a pretty literal way. You don't have to really stretch them. Not literal. Literal can have different meanings, especially if you talk to like Robert Price. Literal has definitely a different meaning than maybe what traditional literalism is meant. But you can take what a lot of the things Jesus has said is very literal. But when you go into Revelations, you start taking these things literally, and it just doesn't glue together.
No, it just doesn't make that much sense. Yeah, you're quite right. In the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels are a fairly easy read, and you can take everything quite literally as part of the narrative. But in Revelation, who knows what's going on?
Yeah, it really goes from the canonical Gospels, which are or the canonical New Testament, where it goes from Synoptic Gospels that are pretty straightforward, and then the Gospel of John, interesting, but pretty straightforward too. Acts are pretty straightforward. It's almost a historical accounting. The letters are just explaining what happened and applying it to their current situation, and then boom, Revelations, and it's like, what's that all about?
Yep. Where did that come from?
when we talked about this book, that it took quite a long time for it to really solidify. Initially, Revelation was really widely accepted. People like Justin Martyr and Polycarp of Smyrna, which Smyrna is one of the 7 cities, and then Polycarp of Smyrna's spiritual son, or his direct disciple, Irenaeus of Lyon, they accepted this book right away. And that's talking like within 50 years of the books being published in the 90s, like really quickly. And those are some heavy hitters too, like Justin Martyr's a big name, Irenaeus, Hippolytus of Rome, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, which his writings are pretty widely respected. Whether he is or not, that's a different story. And a little bit later, Origen was big into Revelation, but he was a big allegorical guy. There was a time, though, where right after that, it got kind of murky, where people weren't very into it, such as there was a writer named Gaius who didn't really like it. And like we said, Dionysius of Alexandria had some problems with it. And it kind of chopped along until certain people thought that Revelation might not have even been written by John, but actually by a Gnostic heretic type person called Cerinthus, because of all the millennial talk, that within 1,000 years there was a heretic called Cerinthus who thought that he believed in a literal millennialism, that within 1,000 years all the stuff, the end times were going to happen. And it just kind of chipped along that way. Augustine of Hippo liked the book. Rufinus of Aquileia and Jerome and Augustine and all of those big names really liked the book. Some big names like Denis of Alexandria, Eusebius of Caesarea, Cyril of Jerusalem, Gregory of Nazianzus, and John Chrysostom had major problems with it. The way that it was written, the grammar that was used in it, the style, they had gigantic, and then gigantic might be a big word, too much for it, but they had enough problems with it that they thought that it probably shouldn't be included in the canon. So you have early writers like Irenaeus, Polycarp, Justin Martyr saying, hey, this is fine. Later writers, Dionysius of Alexandria, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, who are saying, no, this isn't cool in the East, but at the same time, Western writers who are starting to really warm up to it.
So it's much less popular in the East, and it's much less popular as time goes on. Is that right?
And then it kind of comes back into favor,
right,
where you can kind of see where people like Augustine of Hippo, his world was crumbling around him as he was writing. I think that when people who are going through tougher times, an apocalypse like this is a much friendlier book to you than people who maybe aren't seeing that same type of systematic societal crumbling.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like we said, there was books like The Shepherd Hermas that had a lot of really good stuff in it. That doesn't make the biblical canon. Several letters, like I think it was 2 Peter, doesn't make the cut. The Apocalypse of Peter doesn't make the cut. There was a negotiation process to how apostolic something was, and how much did it fit into what the church was, that the early church was trying to build as this is what we're presenting as our sacred literature.
Yes, I think the theory that they had was that a book would only get in if it was written by an apostle, but of course that collided with the, we'd like to really put this book in, so let's pretend it was by an apostle.
Yeah, like the Shepherd Hermas, you can't pretend that was written by an apostle.
No.
Or the pseudo-Clementine literature, which is like, it's so long, first Clement and second Clement, that doesn't make sense at all. Like, you think that Revelation's tricky.
Oh.
The Clementine literature is mind-boggling. It reminds me a lot of like what you say about Enoch. It's really long. It's dense. It's just too much.
Oh, dear. Where they got the time to write this stuff? I just don't know. I mean...
Physically write it, like handwriting, all this stuff. It's not like somebody just, mashing out a book.
There's no internet.
These are thousands of pages of writing, thousands and thousands of lines.
Yeah, of really dense prose.
And so that probably is how the fault line plays out. That the East accepts it with reservations. The West really embraced it. But to a point, as time progressed, by the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther doesn't write a commentary on Revelation, and he had serious problems with it. John Calvin doesn't write anything about it. Knox doesn't write anything about it. They had some serious problems with the book.
Yeah, all the early Protestants really weren't keen on it at all, were they?
And I don't know exactly why, because it kind of plays into their hand.
You'd think if they're struggling against the Catholic Church, you could easily find a pope or two in the beast, couldn't you? You'd think it'd be just perfect for their purposes.
And that's what happens later, is that the harlot of Rome and everything gets placed on popes in Rome. It's very difficult to read the book of Revelation in the standard sola scriptura way. That's kind of like the crack in the armor, because anybody can read that one however they want to.
Yes, it's like a huge Rorschach blot, isn't it? You can get whatever you like out of it.
And it was so difficult to comment on. It's difficult enough for modern commentators to write on, let alone people who didn't have the knowledge of Greek. It's just one of those books where you need to know the Greek that it was written in. You need to know the Hebrew. You need to know Latin. You need to know so many different pieces to tie it all together.
And when knowledge of those pieces disappears, the book becomes almost unintelligible in a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah. Totally.
And Revelation really helps us lead us into the last part of our series, which will be the next part, where we talk about the afterlife in Second Temple Judaism, which led into modern Judaism and Christianity, where you can go someplace pretty good or someplace pretty bad.
Or someplace indeterminate, as some people would have it.
Yeah, there's anywhere in between. You're going to land somewhere, and you're probably going to be judged one way or the other.
That's right, you're going to be judged. We'll see you next time for the final chapter in our series on the apocalypse.
Excellent. That was great. All right, so there you have it. You got the real story of Revelation as interpreted by rational people. I ran this at the same time as Mr. Batman's live stream for a reason, and that is I haven't listened to his presentation. As you saw, I was running the subtitles, but I didn't really follow. So if you want to go to Mr. Batman's channel and listen to his segment on the Revelation and compare it to what Gary and Steve say about the Revelation, then I think you'll find that Mr. Batman is extremely embarrassing. He really embarrasses himself a lot. Um, yeah. You know what? I think that was all that I was going to bring you today. Except, finally, the final thing I want to show you, share with you, is Mr. Batman's argument for God, which I've covered before, but I'm going to cover again. Okay, so he's got basically two premises and then a conclusion. First premise: laws of nature must exist. I don't know about that being a premise, Jim. Laws of nature exist because nature exists. So, what do you mean by laws of nature? There's no such thing as a law of nature. There's laws of physics, there's chemistry, and so on and so forth. But laws of nature is nonsense. That's the first thing. The second thing is premise number 2: laws of nature never change. Okay, so yeah, laws of nature never change. So your first premise is bogus. Laws of nature must exist, obviously. Reality exists. And then second one is laws of nature never change. Of course they never change. What kind of ridiculous premise are these? I mean, these are facts. Facts. And then he comes to a conclusion after that where he says, that proves God. And it doesn't. Because God does not exist. God is a conceptual in nature. God is conceptual in nature, but impossible to actually exist, because existence or reality is infinite. So there's no need for a creation. So these people with their Christianity and their God and their nonsense, I don't know when it's all going to come to an end. But at some point or another, our society, our Western society, is going to reach a point. It's going to reach a level of rationality outside the United States, of course. But we're going to reach a level of rationality where the reason replaces the myth in people's minds. So you're going to get a switch where a lot of people say, I don't believe this God nonsense. It's just a very bad human experiment in hoaxing and scamming. And all I can hope for is that this happens real soon. Real soon. And having said that, thank you for watching.